that's more.
Hey everybody, it is qcknd and welcome back to my channel.
Aww.
Today I wanted to make a kind of quick video, let's hope it's quick, about flea markets. So I wanted to talk about flea markets just because it's something that we do very, very frequently. I would say every other weekend we go to a flea market. And I posted a photo semi-recently of a pair of boots that I found at the flea market. And I felt that like some of the response I got on there maybe warranted this video. So I just wanted to give some of my tips, and they might not be universal tips. They might just be tips that work for people in Pennsylvania, or they might be tips that work for everybody. But I just wanted to talk about flea marketing and give a couple of my tips. I'd also love to know your tips as well. So I would say the first thing, if you want to go to more flea markets or be more acclimated with like flea marketing, is being willing to travel. I would say for the most part, most of the flea markets we go to are on average around 3 hours away. And that is just because if you go to a flea market that's like out of your town or kind of opposite of where you live, there's a good chance that you'll find something a little more unique. And I do feel like flea markets that are in more rural places tend to just be a little bit different than the flea markets that happen in the city. In my experience, the flea markets that happen more suburban or rurally are generally like farmers market kind of things and definitely lean more towards like antique finds, whereas flea markets in the city tend to be more like household goods and collectibles. It is cool to get a big variety, and it's cool to go to different places and just like experience it. I think that flea marketing, you know, it is tedious, but it is cool to find things and repurpose them, but it's also going to be the place where you find replacement parts, or if you're into collectibles or antiques or like into nostalgic type things, like if you want to find a cassette player or a VCR or even a DVD player, I feel like at this point like a flea market's a great place to find it. If you need to fix or replace something that isn't on the market anymore, flea market is a great place to do that. So I feel like it's always good to check them out, especially if you have kind of unique hobbies. This brings me to the types of flea markets. This is kind of just like, I guess like a condensed sort of idea of what types of flea markets there are. And I'm sure there's many different types of flea markets all over the world, but these are just the flea markets I've experienced. And I feel like if you kind of know at least a little bit of what kind of flea market you're going to, or if you can kind of categorize it in the least. Number one, junk markets. So a junk flea market is generally like a hodgepodge of items. They're usually like spread out on a blanket. They don't necessarily fit a category of items, and you could assume that they are trash. Sometimes there are bits and pieces of broken items. Generally they're priced relatively cheap, or they have no price at all, so you can pick something up and offer a price. I think that these markets are good, you know, for that exact thing if you're just looking for odds and ends. These markets are typically outdoors as well, and they usually have like a big giant pile of clothing you need to sort through. In my opinion, these markets are the cheapest but the hardest to navigate and sort through, and also the most time consuming in your shopping experience. So if you are a bargain hunter, a junk market is great for you. Also, if you decide that you want to table at a flea market, it's a good place to start because they usually have the cheapest tables. And they're always the most depressing flea markets to go to. I'll say that. The next category is kind of collectors slash antique flea market. Typically these are held indoors or like indoor-outdoor. And if you are somewhere seasonal, these are generally all year round, whereas outdoor markets are usually closed during the winter. And these markets generally feature almost completely antiques or collectibles. They're generally priced high due to the collector's value, so you might find something interesting that you like but not realize it's an antique. These are especially good if you have a certain thing you collect or for just browsing, because generally these items hold either like a historical value or, you know, you haven't seen them for years, so they have like a nostalgic value. I like browsing these flea markets the most because it's almost like going to a museum, but like completely for free. If you've ever looked up the toy museum, like we all have, one of the biggest toy museums is set up just like an antiques mall. Everything is in glass cases and you just walk around and view these things. So it's great to go to an antiques mall or a flea market and just browse. It's always interesting, and a lot of the pieces, like I said, hold historical value. And hey, if you decide I need that, everything's for sale. So my next flea market type is bootleg. So bootleg flea markets, you're probably kind of familiar with them because I feel like these are either attached to another flea market, generally a junk flea market, and they're generally outside as well. And bootleg flea markets are generally flea markets or flea market stands that sell counterfeit items, bootleg items, replica items, illegal items. And as John puts it, they're all items that fell off of the back of a truck. And I think that that's a gentle way of putting the bootleg markets. Generally, it's a lot of phone case booths, a lot of perfume booths, a lot of weapons booths, like a lot of fantasy weapons booths. But I do love browsing these items, and generally if you find something you can haggle with these vendors. However, flea markets that are primarily like this are not a destination market for me, and I feel like bootleg markets tend to take over markets sometimes. Like if it's a junk market or like a antique / junk market, I feel like the bootleg market will come in and sort of like take over and suffocate these other parts of the market. And I do believe that it's because bootlegs are kind of sensationalized, like you can get a counterfeit purse or something like that. So these markets generally hold value, but like I said, like it's counterfeit items. If you buy makeup from these things, it's almost like, you know, there's a ton of videos on YouTube about buying counterfeit makeup and how dangerous it is. So you are buying counterfeit makeup, counterfeit perfume, counterfeit products like that. John, and this is a true story, John bought us Lysol toilet bowl cleaner that someone had just filled with cherry Coke. And when I called my grandparents about it, they were like, well, cherry Coke will clean the toilet bowl. And I was like, it's not the point. So if you ever see something kind of fishy, like a booth that is selling like 20 things of toilet bowl cleaner, and in your mind you're like, why do they have all this? It could be counterfeit, so not always your best move. I understand why these booths stay in business and there is a demand for these items, but do approach them carefully. And finally, IMO. The last market I have kind of been to are hipster markets. And I say hipster lightly because I know it is a sensitive word, but also a word I tend to gravitate towards. Like, have you been to that new hipster pizza spot? Is phrasing that would kind of excite me. Hipster markets are usually fleas that are put on with like a gathering of like 20-something-year-olds, and they usually offer items that are like DIY items, curated thrifted items, trendy collectibles, small batch edible goods, and for some reason, startups. Every like hipster flea market I've ever been to has always had some like random startup booth there. You know what I mean? But anyway, hipster flea markets are generally more curated, and in my opinion, they always have something I want. If it's, you know, just something that is like a niche I'm really into, or like a band tee kind of booth that's like curated vintage band tees, or a vegan edibles kind of booth. But generally these markets are only a couple times a year, or maybe just once. I feel like these are generally events that are put on and not flea markets that are stationary. I think that these markets are good, but because they are so curated and so specific to a type of person, they do have almost like a hipster tax on them. So you're not going to find the same like rock bottom prices you would find at like a junk flea market, but you're more guaranteed to find something you want because the items have been curated and have been given special care to appear there. So it's always a good market to check out, but 9 times out of 10, you're gonna run into like an old roommate or something, good or bad. So understanding what kind of flea market you've been to before or are going to in the future can always help you understand like what you are looking for. And I think that knowing your desirables is always going to help you when you are navigating a flea market. Unless you're just there to browse or run into your biological father or just like check out what's going on. But for the most part, I like to go to flea markets with an idea of what I'm looking for. Even if it's just a loose idea or like a laundry list of things I've been looking for, I think it's always helpful because if I know I'm looking for a piece of furniture, I'm not going to go to a bootleg market. But if I'm looking for a good time, I might. For me, for the most part, I am a browser, especially for vintage toys and memorabilia. But I also look for furniture, pins, McDonald's, or anything kind of 90s nostalgia related, pennants, historical or vintage Philadelphia items, and fashion with the intention to purchase, but at the right price. For me, I don't have any like huge ticket items on my list, whereas someone like John has a list that kind of has like tools or like antique tools, car parts, vintage signs, other Philadelphia memorabilia. So when he's at the flea market, he is looking for something that might have more value attached to it. Whereas me, I just want some chicken nuggets in a Halloween costume with all of the pieces. They don't even have to be in the bag. They can have old gums stuck to them, and for most of them do. But don't get me wrong, around like 7 out of 10 times that we go to flea markets 3 hours away or 10 minutes down the road, we generally leave empty-handed. But the experience is something I really enjoy too. It's honestly like going to a junk museum and like, sign me up. So finding what flea market to go to can generally be pretty easy. For the most part, for me, I live somewhere seasonal, so most of the flea markets are closed through the winter unless they are indoor markets. And generally, like I said, indoor markets are antiques or farmers markets for the most part. I have been to some cool junk indoor flea markets, but they're definitely like a blend of antique and junk. Flea markets for the most part are on a schedule, so you can find flea markets that are open like every Tuesday, Sunday, or every Saturday, Sunday. And flea markets generally open very early in the morning, like starting around 6 a.m., which also means they close relatively early, so you would have to be ready to go to the flea market, I would say at the latest 10 a.m. Like even just leaving the house at 10 a.m. to get to the flea market, because around 3 it generally fizzles out. And a lot of flea markets are ran by seniors. So by around noon, they've generally been there since, I don't know, 5 a.m. So they generally go home before the flea market is even closed. I've been to flea markets that are open and listed as open, but only a handful of tables are still open and working by the time I get there. Flea markets that are in Philadelphia for the most part that are outdoor are generally every weekend up until like November 1st, and then they start back up in the spring. And it's helpful because these flea markets have been there for like 20 years, so they have like a literal address on Google Maps. So for me, I can search flea market in my maps and a couple will pop up. And there is also like a Philadelphia flea market website, but you can always use Google too. It's kind of how we found for the most part flea markets, and then just like word of mouth. I feel like if you go to flea markets, you talk to people about flea markets and then they'll tell you other flea markets. My grandfather tables at a flea market, so for the most part he will tell us like what's up. So we've been to most of the ones he's recommended, but even John's coworkers have recommended some really good ones. As for miscellaneous flea markets, like ones that are attached to an event or like the hipster flea markets, if I see any flyers around town, I'll take a picture of them and I'll set a reminder on my phone that'll usually go off like a day before the flea market to see if I still want to go to it, if it's something I'm interested in. and I kind of do that a little blindly. It's a little exciting for me. But if I ever see any of my friends talking about a flea market online, or like any of my mutuals, I'll always ask them which one they went to. There's some really good ones in New Jersey, and I've actually found the same vendor. She's this one girl, I don't know if you know my Tropicana shirt I posted on my Instagram, but I've seen her vending at a couple markets, and her stuff's always super tight. So if you get close with a vendor, you can also ask them where they will be vending. And it might be the same booth all the time, but like her, it could be different booths all the time. Also, probably Facebook, I don't know. So we'll end this video with navigating flea markets. For most flea markets, it's a good idea to go early. 6 a.m. might be too early for you. It generally is for us. But if you go early, then all of the items are there. So you go early to get the best selection. But if you go later, sometimes there is a better ability to haggle if you're at an outside flea market. Indoor flea markets, those people generally rent those booths for months or years, so not the best. But if you're at an outdoor flea market, generally you can price things because people don't want to lug it back to their car, especially for larger things. If they've already made their base price to pay off their table and whatever, sometimes you can just throw numbers at people. It's definitely how I've gotten McDonald's toys. So, huge mountains of clothing. I touched on this before, but for me, a huge big pile of clothes is usually a red flag for me. It's not something I'm interested in sorting through. Usually you can get a pretty good price on these items, but I feel like there's not a lot of effort on behalf of the seller who just kicks this giant pile out of the back of their minivan and they're like, look for it. There's some Arrow pastel in there. And you're like, so? If you search through a giant pile of shoes, you happen to find your size and you happen to find the match, and you're like, how much are these? And the seller's like, well, those are Converse, so I have to ask for $12. And you're like, I just did all the hard work for you. I would say $2. You can see why like it's not worth it because of that situation.
Not to mention mold and rats and anything else disgusting or wet, like that big pile of clothes I showed inside of the indoor market. Like, don't even touch that for your health.
But for the most part, when I see a giant mountain of clothes, it usually says like, everything is $1, blah, blah, blah. Like, if you're going for something like that, for sure. But if you find a booth that has curated clothing, which is something that I would look at, you will pay a little bit more of a premium because the seller has sorted through these items and curated them in a way that like even put them on hangers or put them as women's clothes, like something even as like minorly categorized as that. I found those Doc Marten boots that I posted on my Instagram, and a lot of people were like, what booth did you get this at, and like what seller? And the thing about that is I did get it at a junk flea market, so the booth didn't have a theme and it was a junk pile, but it was all shoes on a blanket, and it was just like a lady, and she had some idea of what she had. She said they were Doc Martens, so I had to pay a certain price for them. However, the odds of that lady being there again or ever having Doc Martens again are very slim. I've had this happen on more than one occasion where I've been to like a toy vendor and I talked to them about what I was looking for and they gave me their card. That can happen, but clothes can be tricky. In my opinion, they're a lot of work for very little yield, but I also think that a thrift store is a similar price as a flea market, and a thrift store at least is a little more curated and at least has a little bit more of a standard, like clothes that may not have holes in them. Like, you don't know when you're searching through this giant pile. So I tend to avoid that unless I'm at like a hipster market, because then I know like at least I'm putting my time into something I might like. And this is kind of a similar situation across anything you may collect. Like, John has had stories where he's gone through giant junk piles and found like a roof nailer, and the guy still wanted like a premium price for it even though it was just junk on the ground in a pile of other junk, just like not taken care of or looked after at all. So you can find things like that, and I always recommend to just like leave them alone unless you have that kind of time. So I'll close this out with saying that going to flea markets is obviously a personal experience, and One that is great for someone who is a collector, vintage, outdated electronics, and everything is cash in hand, so it's kind of like a thrilling experience, almost like a pirate experience, if you will, for trading for goods. Like I even said in this video, you can go to a flea market for so many different reasons, but it is always cool to go, especially if you have a collection or you wanted to see something from yesteryear, which is definitely the vibe of almost every flea market. Seeing something that you played with as a kid. One thing that I see kind of often is this mirror my grandmom had in our kitchen that has like a yellow chair painted on it. I see this at flea markets sometimes and I just go crazy for it. So it's always really cool to go, but obviously personalized experience. You could go every weekend, like looking for an action figure that you can't find, or just go to Hangout with the freaks. I feel like it has made me a more conscious consumer when I am buying products new. You would be surprised how long people hold on to things because they attribute value to them, and then you see them at the flea market trying to pass that value on and continue it, and it can be interesting and exciting. It has taught me to be more thrifty, for better or worse, and I think it's an experience that all of us could get into. So from me to you, these are my tips on flea markets. I love you guys so much, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. If you want to see more videos like this, definitely leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is something I'm relatively passionate about, so I was like, I don't really talk about this, do I? Alright, I love you guys. Bye.
Hey everyone, it is VoiceOver Quicken reminding you to hit that subscribe button if you want to hang out. It is absolutely free to hit, and you can also hit that notification bell for up-to-date post notifications. Drop a comment, tell me what you liked about the video, and until next time, mwah! Ugh.